Before the lights, the legends, or the platinum records, there was a raw, ruthless ambition burning at the heart of Motown. And that fire, at times, scorched the very souls that built its empire. Smokey Robinson wasn't just a witness to Berry Gordy's rise. He was the man beside the man, the pen behind the hits, the charm behind the curtain. But now, after decades of silence, Smokey's finally peeling back the curtain. And what he reveals about Berry Gordy's Greediest move could rewrite everything we thought we knew about Motown's golden era. To understand just how deep this betrayal runs, you have to go back to Detroit in 1959. Motown Records wasn't even Motown yet. It was Tamla, operating out of a modest home on West Grand Boulevard. Berry Gordy, a former boxer and failed record store owner, had one last shot, and he staked it all on a vision, a black-owned record label that could compete with the white-controlled music giants of the time. Smokey Robinson was just a kid with poetry in his veins and a falsetto that could melt steel. When he met Gordy after a failed audition with Jackie Wilson, everything changed. Gordy didn't just see potential, he saw a dynasty. And Smokey, he was the first brick in that empire. Smokey Robinson became Gordy's golden boy. As the frontman of the Miracles and more importantly as a songwriter, Smokey penned some of the most important records in American music history. Shop Around, Tracks of My Tears, My Guy, My Girl. He wasn't just writing hits, he was building the blueprint, and Berry Gordy knew it. But what nobody knew, what Smokey would only later confess, was that while he was pouring out his soul for the label, Berry Gordy was quietly structuring the company to own every drop of it. Then in 1961, a decision was made that would lock Smokey and many others into a cage that glittered like gold. Berry Gordy created Jobete Music, Motown's in-house publishing company. Now, to the outside world, it looked like a smart business move. Owning the publishing meant more revenue stayed in-house, but inside Motown's machine, it was something else entirely. Berry Gordy insisted that nearly every artist sign over their publishing rights to Jobete. It didn't matter if you were writing your own songs. It didn't matter if your lyrics built the brand. If you wanted to stay in the family, you gave up ownership. And Smokey, despite being one of the label's pillars, was no exception. For years, Smokey stayed silent. Maybe it was loyalty, maybe it was love, because truth be told, Berry and Smokey were more than just business partners, they were brothers. When Smokey married Claudette Rogers from the Miracles, Gordy stood by his side. When Smokey's family went through turmoil, Gordy helped pick up the pieces. But behind that friendship, the money was flowing one way. While Smokey's lyrics earned millions, the lion's share was going into Jobete and directly into Gordy's pockets. Then came 1972. Smokey Robinson, tired and disillusioned, announced he was retiring from the Miracles to focus on his role as vice president of Motown. But the truth was more complicated. According to Smokey himself, it wasn't just about family or exhaustion. It was about watching other people make fortunes off the sweat of his pen. The man who had written over 4,000 songs had shockingly little control over the publishing empire he helped build. That year marked a turning point. Smokey wasn't just questioning the music, he was questioning the business. Yet he didn't speak out, not publicly, not yet, because Berry Gordy still held the keys. And leaving Motown entirely, that was almost unthinkable. Motown wasn't just a label, it was a mythos. And Gordy had created an environment where speaking out could cost you everything. Just ask Florence Ballard, or Mary Wells, or even Marvin Gaye, who had to fight tooth and nail for artistic freedom. Smokey was smarter than that. He played the long game. But the longer he stayed, the clearer the picture became. Artists who had created cultural milestones had almost no stake in their own legacy. The Jackson 5, pushed to the moon by Motown, didn't own their name when they tried to leave. Mary Wells, the first female star of the label, walked away with barely a dime. And behind it all, Jobete, the publishing vault, the golden goose, and every feather of that goose was plucked from the backs of the artists. Then in 1988, the dam finally cracked. Berry Gordy, sensing the industry was shifting and hungry for a payout, sold Motown Records for $61 million to MCA and Boston Ventures. But he didn't just sell the label, he kept Jobete. He sold the house but held onto the deed. And that, Smokey would later suggest, was Gordy's greediest move of all. Because in that moment, every artist who had ever trusted Motown was left in the dust. The songs that changed the world, still owned by Gordy. The publishing catalogs that had funded his mansions, his movies, even his failures untouched. Smokey didn't say it directly at first, but when asked years later in interviews why artists from Motown weren't wealthier, he said something chilling. If you don't own what you create, you're just renting your own soul. By the 1990s, artists like Prince were making headlines fighting for their masters. But Smokey had lived that war quietly for decades, And when younger artists asked him for advice, his message was simple: don't give it away, not your name, not your rights, not your songs, because he had lived the alternative, and he knew exactly what it cost. In a 2004 interview with the Los Angeles Times, Smokey finally cracked the silence just enough to let the truth breathe. He said, Berry was a genius, but sometimes the genius didn't share. It was a diplomatic shot, but anyone who knew the backstory heard the scream behind it. The man who had helped Gordy build Motown from scratch was admitting that the empire had been built, at least in part, on exploitation. The aftermath of Berry Gordy's sale of Motown wasn't just a business transaction. It was a spiritual rupture. To the outside world, it looked like a natural move, an aging mogul cashing out. But inside the hearts of the artists who built the empire, it felt like abandonment. Smokey Robinson, the man who'd once stood shoulder to shoulder with Gordy in that tiny Hitsville house, watched the soul of Motown become property, transferred like a used car between corporate hands. And the music. Still chained to Jobete, still controlled by Gordy, still out of reach for the very people who wrote it. In private, Smokey's tone shifted, not bitter, but unmistakably disillusioned. He began to speak more openly at songwriter panels and music summits about the importance of owning your work. Younger musicians saw him as a mentor, but his advice came with a warning carved from experience. He told them how he once trusted a system because it was wrapped in friendship, how loyalty had been weaponized into silence, and how brilliance could still be used against you when the contracts were stacked. Then in 1997, something happened that brought years of buried resentment rushing back to the surface. Berry Gordy decided to sell half of Jobete Music, the publishing crown jewel, for a reported $132 million to EMI. Let that sink in. The sale of the actual record label had fetched $61 million, but just half of the song rights, over double. That's how valuable those songs were. And Smokey's catalog, his words, his melodies, were among the most lucrative of them all. Yet again, Gordy was the only one cashing the check. This moment quietly devastated many Motown veterans, but Smokey's reaction was especially personal. Because unlike Marvin Gaye, who had died in turmoil, or Florence Ballard, who died broke, Smokey was still here, still breathing, still creating, and still watching someone else profit from the echoes of his younger self. It was the ultimate reminder. The business had never really belonged to the artists. It had always belonged to the businessman. And yet Smokey didn't burn the bridge. He didn't call Gordy out by name. He didn't sue. He didn't write a tell-all book. What he did was arguably more haunting. He kept telling the truth in pieces, in interviews, in lyrics, in knowing silences. And one of the most cutting moments came during the 2013 Motown tribute concert at the White House. Surrounded by presidents, legends, and cameras, Smokey Robinson was asked what Motown meant to him. He smiled, paused, and said, "Motown was the dream, but not all dreams are free." That one line told 1,000 stories, because behind the music, behind the matching suits and the choreography, was a contract. Behind the harmony was a hierarchy, and at the top of that pyramid sat Berry Gordy, collecting checks off the backs of songwriters who had been promised family but handed deals that stole generational wealth. What makes this story even more painful is that Smokey had options. As one of the most gifted writers of his era, he could have gone solo. He could have started his own label. Others did, like Curtis Mayfield with Curtum or Isaac Hayes at Stax, but Smokey stayed. He stayed because he believed, because he loved, and because Gordy was more than just a boss, he was a father figure. That kind of loyalty doesn't just break overnight. It shatters slowly, over years, over contracts, over moments of clarity that come too late. By the 2000s, Smokey's tone shifted from quiet regret to subtle defiance. In his solo tour and appearances, he started reclaiming his catalog in spirit, if not in law. He performed with a renewed intensity. He told stories between songs, not just about the music, but about what it meant to lose ownership of it. He spoke to young artists like he was passing down a secret survival map. And the message was always the same: don't confuse the spotlight for power. Don't confuse applause for equity. One story Smokey shared involved the creation of My Girl, one of the most iconic songs in music history. Written for the Temptations, the song generated millions in revenue, was covered by dozens of artists, used in commercials, movies, TV shows, you name it. But the publishing, owned by Jobete. And to this day, every time that sweet bass line opens the track, someone's getting paid, and it's not the man who wrote it. That's the trap Smokey kept pointing to. At Motown, they weren't just writing hits, they were writing annuities, financial assets, but they didn't know it, because Berry Gordy did know it. He understood publishing better than any of them. And while the artists were busy chasing perfection in the studio, Gordy was chasing ownership in the boardroom. And here's the kicker: Jobete wasn't just a publishing company. It was an iron vault. When artists left Motown, their songs didn't go with them. When they struggled financially, they couldn't sell what they didn't own. For many, that vault became a prison. And while Gordy did eventually sell off more of Jobete over time, the timing always benefited him, never the artists. He sold during market highs, while the creators were often in financial decline. Then in 2021, in a rare candid podcast interview, Smokey dropped what might be his sharpest line yet. When asked if he ever regretted staying so long at Motown, his voice dipped just slightly and he said, "Regret, no, but I learned the cost of believing a handshake was a contract." That was the moment many fans realized Smokey had never fully forgiven Gordy, not because of some single betrayal, but because of a pattern, a business built on smiling exploitation, where friendship was the brand but business was the blood, where the man you trusted most might also be the one holding the deed to your life's work. And maybe that's what made Berry Gordy's Greediest move so tragic. It wasn't the publishing contracts, or the corporate sales, or even the vault full of stolen royalties. It was the manipulation of belief. Smokey didn't just give away his rights, he gave them to someone he thought was family. And that kind of betrayal doesn't fade with time. It lingers. In every song, in every check you don't receive, in every crowd that sings your lyrics while someone else counts the money. There's a moment that rarely gets talked about. It's not flashy. It didn't happen on a stage or in a courtroom. It happened backstage at a Motown reunion, years after the empire had been sold off in pieces. Smokey and Berry were in the same room again, two old titans with decades of memories and millions of dollars in tension between them. A younger artist, watching from the shadows, recalled the encounter years later. Smokey embraced Gordy, but it wasn't warm, it was formal, respectful. Professional, the love was still there, but the trust, that was long gone. And that's the tragedy inside the genius of Berry Gordy. He wasn't just a mogul, he was a master manipulator of emotions. He didn't exploit people with threats, he exploited their dreams. He convinced young, hungry black artists that they were part of something bigger, something revolutionary, and in many ways they were. Motown broke color lines. It changed pop music forever, but the artists didn't share in the profits the way they should have. They gave Gordy their youth, their creativity, their trust, and in return they got exposure, applause, and crumbs. What Berry Gordy did with Jobete was more than a business maneuver. It was a case study in silent control. He created a structure where even the most brilliant creators like Smokey Robinson didn't own the very essence of their genius. That's not just greed, that's architecture. He engineered dependence. But here's where the story shifts, because Smokey didn't become bitter. He didn't fade into nostalgia or let the betrayal define him. Instead, he evolved. He used his voice to educate the next wave of musicians, not with rage, but with realism. And in doing so, he began quietly reclaiming the power Berry had taken. In 2005, Smokey started advocating for artist rights in ways Gordy never did. He partnered with organizations pushing for reform in music publishing law. He spoke openly about how artists, especially black artists, needed financial literacy, legal protection, and ownership awareness. He didn't name names. He didn't drag Gordy through the mud. But the subtext was crystal clear. Don't let another Motown happen to you. What made Smokey's late career shift so powerful wasn't just the wisdom. It was the grace. He could have torched Gordy publicly. He could have dropped lawsuits or written exposed memoirs. But Smokey chose a longer path, a higher road. And maybe that's what makes his message cut even deeper. Because when someone as kind, loyal, and visionary as Smokey Robinson quietly reveals that he was taken advantage of, what does that say about the man who took? The irony, of course, is that Gordy always saw himself as the hero. In interviews, he credits himself for giving black artists a platform, for teaching them the industry, for putting them in rooms they otherwise couldn't enter. And to some degree, he's right. But what he never seems to mention is the cost, because visibility without ownership is just a prettier form of oppression. And Gordy, knowingly or not, built an empire on that imbalance. Then came the final twist no one saw coming. In 2019, Smokey Robinson was honored at the Library of Congress for his contributions to American songwriting. It was a historic moment, but what made it more poignant was this. When his catalog was discussed, there were no Jobete executives in the spotlight, no EMI reps, no mention of publishing rights. The applause was for him, and only him. The world was finally recognizing what Motown never fully did, that Smokey's words weren't just hits, they were heritage. And as the ceremony ended and Smokey stood on that stage in D.C., you could almost hear the full circle echo. The kid from Detroit who once signed away his publishing rights was now being immortalized, not because of the contracts he signed, but because of the soul he never sold. In that moment, Berry Gordy's name was a footnote. Smokey Robinson's legacy stood alone. In recent interviews, when asked about his relationship with Gordy, Smokey chooses his words carefully. He says things like, "Berry had to make tough choices, or we were all learning as we went." But when he talks about ownership, his tone changes. The warmth fades. He becomes a teacher, a survivor, a man who watched too many of his peers die broke while their music made fortunes for people who never sang a note. That's the wound that still hasn't healed, not just for Smokey, but for the entire Motown generation. They changed the world but didn't get to keep the keys, and Berry Gordy's greediest move, it wasn't just taking their rights, it was convincing them that he never did. Because the genius of Berry Gordy wasn't just that he built Motown, it was that he convinced the world he did it alone. He became the face of a movement powered by voices he didn't fairly compensate. And while Smokey Robinson will always honor the music they made together, he's no longer honoring the myth. In the end, Gordy's legacy is complicated. He built a black business empire in an era of brutal segregation. He launched legends. He brought Motown to the world. But beneath that legacy lies a cold truth. The man who claimed to uplift artists also trapped them in golden cages. And maybe that's the final revelation Smokey Robinson leaves us with, not just a warning to future artists, but a challenge to the entire music industry. Because if Motown, the greatest black-owned label of all time, could do this to its own family, what does that say about everyone else? Smokey's voice, smooth as ever, still fills arenas, but now when he sings those classics, there's something heavier behind the lyrics. Not bitterness, not rage, but wisdom forged from betrayal, the kind of wisdom that can't be bought, and that, unlike the publishing rights, no one can ever take from him.